Tonight, we uncover a story buried beneath centuries of faith, a rivalry older than any religion, and a secret that may change everything we think we know about divine power. They say the walls of Rome hold every secret, but some are buried far deeper, beneath the salt-crusted stones of French harbors, in the fog that rolls across Scottish highlands, and perhaps even in lands that medieval cartographers left blank and labeled with dragons. You are about to embark on a journey that spans continents and centuries, a tale of warrior monks, a king's betrayal, and an entire fleet of ships that simply ceased to exist one autumn night in 1307. I should warn you, this is the kind of story that burrows into your mind like a determined little mole, and you probably won't survive this, at least not with your comfortable assumptions about history intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. While you're settling in, perhaps drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. I always find it wonderfully strange to imagine this same story floating into ears across Tokyo at midnight, London at tea time, and somewhere in Kansas where it's probably corn o'clock, which I believe is their main unit of temporal measurement. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1307, and you find yourself standing on the stone quays of La Rochelle, a French port city that smells of brine, tar, and centuries of accumulated fish-related regrets. The Knights Templar, that legendary order of warrior monks who have dominated the imagination of conspiracy theorists and Dan Brown readers alike for generations, maintain their primary naval headquarters here. You can hear the gentle slap of water against hulls, the creak of rope and timber, and somewhere in the darkness, the soft murmur of men who know that something terrible is coming. The Templars at this moment are, on paper at least, one of the most powerful organizations in Christendom. They answer only to the Pope. They possess financial networks that would make modern investment bankers weep with envy, and they have a fleet of ships capable of controlling Mediterranean trade routes. They invented what we might call the first international banking system, allowing pilgrims to deposit money in one country and withdraw it in another, which honestly sounds like a medieval invention that should have earned them far more recognition than their reputation for mysterious rituals and hoarding treasure. Here is something the historians can actually verify. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, yes, this is almost certainly where our superstition about that date originates, making the Templars responsible for Jason Voorhees in a roundabout way. King Philip IV of France issued secret orders to arrest every Templar in his kingdom simultaneously. The warrants were sealed and distributed weeks in advance, with strict instructions not to open them until that fateful Friday morning, a logistical achievement that would be impressive even with modern communications, let alone in an era when the fastest message traveled at horse speed minus pothole delays. Philip owed the Templars enormous sums of money borrowed to fund his various wars, and when you owe your banker enough gold, apparently the medieval solution was to accuse them of heresy, confiscate their property, and avoid repayment through the simple expedient of burning everyone who might send you a collection notice. The charges were extraordinary and almost certainly fabricated. The Templars were accused of denying Christ, worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, spitting on the cross, and engaging in what the medieval courts delicately termed obscene kisses during their initiation rituals. Under torture, and I cannot stress enough how much medieval torture encourages creative confession, many Templars admitted to whatever their interrogators suggested, which is roughly as reliable as asking someone if they committed crimes while you're actively removing their fingernails. But here is where our story takes its peculiar turn into the mist-shrouded realm of legend and missing records. The Templar naval fleet, stationed at La Rochelle, and we're talking about a substantial armada here, possibly 18 ships or more according to various accounts, simply vanished. When Philip's men arrived at the harbor, the quays were empty. The ships had sailed into the night, and no contemporary account reliably tells us where they went. You stand there in our imagined recreation, watching the fog roll in from the Atlantic, and you can almost see the ghostly outlines of those vessels disappearing into the darkness, their white sails catching the last moonlight before they fade from history's view entirely. Here's a quirky detail that rarely makes it into the serious histories. Some of the Templar ships allegedly had carved figureheads depicting strange beasts, and at least one account mentions a vessel with a mermaid, whose sculptor had apparently never seen a woman and had only a vague understanding of fish, resulting in what one horrified witness described as looking like an angry trout wearing a wig. Medieval art criticism was apparently brutal. The question of what happened to the Templar fleet remains one of those scholarly debates where tenured professors can get surprisingly passionate at conferences, and I've been told that at least one academic paper on the subject was delivered through gritted teeth at a symposium in Paris, which suggests that even dry historical questions can generate remarkably moist levels of academic rivalry. The air in La Rochelle that autumn night would have been cold enough to make your breath visible, carrying the last warmth of summer out to sea along with whatever cargo those mysterious ships held in their bellies. Some say the fleet carried the legendary Templar treasure, accumulated wealth from 2 centuries of donations, banking profits and plunder from the Crusades. Others whisper that the cargo was something far stranger, sacred relics, ancient documents, perhaps even the Holy Grail itself, though I should note that the Holy Grail makes an appearance in approximately 70% of all medieval mysteries, which suggests either that it was very real, or that medieval people really liked the idea of magic cups. You're breathing that salt air now, letting it fill your lungs while somewhere in the darkness, oars dip silently into black water, and carry secrets away from a kingdom that would soon burn with the fires of Inquisition. The Knights Templar had existed for nearly 200 years by this point, founded in 1119 by a French knight named Hugues de Payens and 8 of his companions, who pledged to protect Christian pilgrims on the dangerous roads to Jerusalem. They grew from these humble beginnings, 9 men protecting roads, into an organization with over 15,000 members, extensive landholdings across Europe, and a financial system so sophisticated that they essentially invented the checking account, which admittedly sounds less romantic than seeking the Holy Grail, but was probably more useful to the average medieval traveler worried about bandits. The order had survived 2 centuries of crusading, the loss of the Holy Land, political intrigues, and the kind of internal drama that would make a reality television producer salivate, only to be brought down by a king's greed and a Friday the 13th arrest warrant. As you stand on that imaginary quay, you might notice a rat scurrying past your feet. Rats are always scurrying in these stories, it's practically a union requirement, and you wonder if even the rats knew what was coming, whether they sensed the tremor in the kingdom's foundations before any human did. The ships that left La Rochelle that night carried more than men and cargo. They carried questions that historians would still be arguing about 7 centuries later, which is either a testament to the profound mystery of the event, or evidence that academics really do need better hobbies. You hear the last bell of some distant church marking the canonical hours, a sound the Templars would have known intimately from their daily prayers, and you realize that for those fleeing knights, that bell might have been the last familiar sound of the world they were leaving behind. Where did they go? What did they carry? And why did an entire fleet simply dissolve into the historical record like sugar in the ocean? These are the questions that will carry us forward tonight, gentle sleeper, as we trace the ghostly wake of ships that sailed beyond the edge of documented history and into the realm of speculation, legend, and that particular kind of mystery that makes people write very long books with very dramatic titles. The stones beneath your feet are cold now, and the fog has thickened until you can barely see your hand before your face, which is the universe's way of telling you that some secrets prefer darkness, and we're just getting started. You drift now through the strange twilight of historical conjecture, where the solid ground of documented fact gives way to the softer terrain of educated guessing, and the occasional scholarly equivalent of throwing darts blindfolded. The Templar fleet has vanished from La Rochelle, and we must trace the possible routes those ghostly ships might have taken across the wine-dark sea that Homer loved so much, though Homer was describing the Mediterranean, and our Templars are sailing the Atlantic, which is considerably less wine-colored and substantially more likely to kill you. Let us first consider what we actually know about the days leading up to that fateful October night, because context is everything, and also because I enjoy the way verified history makes the mysterious parts feel even more deliciously strange by comparison. Pope Clement V, who was essentially under Philip IV's thumb, and operating from Avignon rather than Rome. Scholars debate whether he was a puppet or merely a very cooperative ally, which in practical terms meant the same thing for the Templars, had summoned Grand Master Jacques de Molay to France in 1307. De Molay came willingly, apparently unaware that walking into Philip's kingdom was roughly equivalent to a turkey wandering into a butcher shop, while enthusiastically gobbling about trust. The Grand Master had actually served as a pallbearer at a royal funeral just 1 day before the arrests, which gives you a sense of how sudden and shocking the betrayal must have felt. Imagine helping carry someone's coffin and then discovering that your hosts had been planning your destruction for months, which admittedly makes awkward Thanksgiving dinners seem rather minor by comparison. The verified historical fact for this section involves the actual arrest operation itself. Historians estimate that between 500 and 2,000 Templars were arrested across France on that single Friday morning, a coordinated strike that required extraordinary secrecy and planning. Philip's seneschals had received their sealed orders weeks in advance with strict instructions not to open them until the appointed day, creating what was essentially a medieval distributed denial of service attack on the entire Templar organization. The charges were read out publicly, the Templars were hauled before inquisitors, and the machinery of medieval justice, which moved at the speed of bureaucracy fueled by genuine religious terror, ground into motion. But here's the thing that keeps treasure hunters awake at night. The Templar headquarters in Paris, the famous temple, was indeed raided, and yet the legendary treasury was strangely depleted. Where exactly all that gold went remains unclear, though I suspect someone at the temple invented the first offshore banking scheme and simply forgot to leave a forwarding address. You're walking now through the halls of the temple itself, or at least the memory of them, since the actual building was demolished during the French Revolution, because revolutionaries apparently disliked architectural reminders of the old regime almost as much as they disliked the old regime itself. The stones beneath your feet echo with the footsteps of knights who once walked these corridors, in their white mantles, emblazoned with red crosses, men who had sworn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and who now faced charges so horrific that even their brothers in other countries initially refused to believe them. The quirky historical tidbit that deserves mention here involves the Templar banking system's actual sophistication, which would impress financial regulators today. The Templars issued what we might call letters of credit, allowing a pilgrim to deposit, say, 50 silver marks in London, and withdraw the equivalent value in Jerusalem, minus a small transaction fee. They essentially invented traveler's checks about 800 years before American Express, and they did it using coded documents that referenced the depositor by description rather than name, providing a level of privacy protection that modern banks have largely abandoned in favor of selling your data to advertisers. You can almost smell the ink and parchment of their accounting offices, the dust of ledgers that recorded transactions across Christendom, and the faint desperation of a financial empire, realizing that its biggest debtor has decided that murder is a simpler accounting solution than repayment. Here is where scholarly debate becomes particularly heated, generating the kind of academic disagreements that result in tersely worded footnotes and pointed exclusion from conference dinner parties. Did the Templars have advance warning of the arrests? Some historians argue that the fleet's disappearance proves they knew what was coming. Others suggest the ships had simply left on routine business and their absence from port was coincidental. The truth probably lies somewhere in the murky middle, where it prefers to hide in most historical questions, drinking mysterious cocktails and refusing to give straight answers. Evidence suggests that at least some Templars received warning. A surprisingly small number of senior knights were actually captured in that first sweep, considering how many lived in France, and the complete absence of the naval fleet certainly suggests that someone in the organization had contacts at court who whispered secrets. You're standing on the deck of one of those vanished ships now, feeling the roll and pitch of the Atlantic beneath your feet, the salt spray catching in your hair, and you wonder what it felt like to be a Templar knight sailing into exile and uncertainty, leaving behind everything you knew for a destination that might not even exist on any map you possess. The sailors around you move with practiced efficiency, adjusting the rigging as the wind shifts, and you notice that several of them wear no crosses at all. They're hired-hand maritime professionals who care more about wages than religious politics, and who probably wish their passengers would stop praying quite so loudly because it's affecting crew morale. The sea at night is astonishingly dark when you're far from any coastline. There's a blackness to it that modern humans, surrounded by our electric glow, rarely experience anymore, and in that darkness you could sail anywhere. The stars wheel overhead, the same stars that guided Phoenician merchants, Viking raiders, and eventually Columbus himself, and you realize that celestial navigation was both incredibly precise and terrifyingly imprecise at the same time, like knowing exactly where you are relative to heaven, while having only a vague notion of where any given coastline might be lurking to wreck you. Where would a fleet of desperate Templars sail in October 1307? The Mediterranean was controlled by Philip's allies, and would offer no safety. The coast of Spain was possible but dangerous. The Spanish kingdoms had their own ambitions regarding Templar property. Portugal, interestingly, would eventually refuse to persecute the Templars, and simply rename them the Order of Christ, which is the medieval equivalent of a corporate rebranding, to avoid bad press, and they would go on to fund Portuguese exploration, including a certain navigator named Vasco da Gama, who sailed under their banner. But Portugal couldn't shelter an entire fleet without drawing attention. No, if the Templars wanted to truly disappear, they needed to sail somewhere beyond the easy reach of papal authority and French diplomacy, somewhere cold and remote, and decidedly lacking in the creature comforts that 2 centuries of religious warfare had accustomed them to enjoying. Scotland, some say, called to them, Scotland, where Robert the Bruce was excommunicated, and fighting for independence, where papal writs held no authority, and where a strange alliance between warrior monks and warrior kings might just be possible. You feel the ship turning beneath you, adjusting course northward, and the temperature drops a few degrees as if the sea itself knows where you're heading. Others whisper of even more distant shores, lands beyond the Western Ocean, where the Templars might have made landfall generations before Columbus claimed his discovery for Spain, which is either the most romantic possibility or the most ridiculous, depending on which historian you ask and how much they've had to drink at the conference reception. The waves grow larger as you sail beyond the protection of the coast, and somewhere in the darkness, a sailor begins humming an old French song about a maiden waiting for her lover to return from the sea, which is beautiful until you remember that roughly half of all medieval sea songs end with the maiden waiting forever, because her lover became fish food, medieval audiences apparently enjoying tragic irony with their entertainment. The Templar knight standing beside you at the rail says nothing. He has taken vows of silence during certain hours, but you can see in his eyes the particular look of a man who has lost everything except his faith, and who is gambling that faith on a voyage into the unknown. The ship creaks around you, timber speaking to timber in the language of stress and strain, and you close your eyes and let the rhythm of the waves carry you forward into dreams of shorelines yet to come, mist-shrouded and mysterious, waiting to receive whatever secrets these fugitive ships carry in their holds. The theories about the Templar fleet's destination spread across the map like spilled wine on parchment, staining different countries with possibility and leaving historians to debate which stains matter and which are merely accidents of speculation. You find yourself now standing on the Scottish coast, somewhere in the vicinity of Argyll, where the sea locks cut deep into the land like fingers probing for secrets, and the mist hangs so thick that you could spread it on bread if you were desperate enough, which, given medieval Scottish cuisine, someone probably tried at least once. The Scotland theory is perhaps the most popular among those who prefer their history mixed with a healthy dose of romantic possibility, and it goes something like this. Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by the Pope and fighting for Scottish independence against the English, would have been utterly indifferent to papal orders demanding Templar arrest, making Scotland one of the few places in Christendom where fleeing knights might find sanctuary. The timing is certainly suggestive. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Bruce's outnumbered forces decisively defeated the English army, occurred just 7 years after the Templar arrests, and some accounts mention a mysterious reserve force that charged into battle at a crucial moment, turning the tide. Were these Templar knights repaying their debt to the Scottish king who sheltered them? The idea is intoxicating, like finding out that the mysterious stranger who saved the day in your favorite movie was actually a famous historical figure in disguise, except the historical figure in question is an entire military order of warrior monk, which admittedly stretches the disguise concept somewhat. Here is the mainstream historical fact that grounds this section in something approaching scholarly consensus. We know with certainty that Templar properties in Scotland were indeed investigated by papal inquisitors, but the investigations were remarkably lackadaisical compared to those in France. Only 2 Templars were ever arrested in Scotland, both of whom were eventually released, and the Scottish Church seemed almost deliberately slow in carrying out Rome's instructions. Whether this was because there were no Templars to find, or because the Scots were hiding them, or simply because Scottish bureaucracy moved at its own unique pace, which, judging by modern experience with any bureaucracy anywhere, seems entirely plausible, remains an open question that energizes researchers to this day. The quirky tidbit I must share with you involves Rosslyn Chapel, that small 15th century church near Edinburgh, that became famous through its appearance in the Da Vinci Code, and has since been investigated by approximately every documentary filmmaker who owns a camera and possesses opinions about hidden history. The chapel wasn't built until 1446, well over a century after the Templar dissolution, but its elaborate stone carvings include what some believe to be Masonic symbols, supposed corncobs that shouldn't exist in Scotland before Columbus reached America, and enough green men and mysterious figures to fuel speculation through the next millennium. Professional archaeologists generally respond to Rosslyn theories with the kind of patient exhaustion usually reserved for parents, explaining for the 100th time why dessert comes after dinner. But the theories persist, breeding in the Scottish mist like particularly enthusiastic rumors. You're walking through that mist now, climbing a rocky path toward a castle ruin that overlooks the sea, and you can hear sheep complaining somewhere in the grayness, which is the authentic Scottish soundtrack that all these mysterious locations require. The scholarly debate that matters here concerns the actual documentary evidence, or rather, the suspicious lack of it for Templar presence in Scotland after 1307. Some archives that might have contained relevant records were destroyed, others were never properly catalogued, and still others seem to have developed convenient gaps exactly where you'd expect to find Templar-related materials, which is either proof of cover-up or proof that medieval Scottish record-keeping was about as reliable as medieval Scottish weather forecasting. Which is to say, not very. Historians like Helen Nicholson and Malcolm Barber have spent careers trying to separate Templar fact from Templar fiction, and they would probably appreciate it if the internet stopped treating every old stone building in Scotland as a secret Templar headquarters. But the internet has its own priorities, and those priorities apparently involve maximum mystery. But let us sail further, shall we? Let us follow those who believe the Templar ships carried their secrets not merely to Scotland but beyond, across the Atlantic itself, to lands that European maps left blank, or filled with imaginative sea monsters. You're standing now on a different shore, one where the trees are unfamiliar, and the birds call in voices you've never heard, and the year is perhaps 1308, or 1398, or some other date that has been proposed by those who believe the Templars discovered America before Columbus made landfall in 1492. The idea isn't entirely without foundation, though that foundation is constructed more of suggestive anomalies than solid evidence, the kind of structure that wouldn't pass building inspection, but looks impressive from a distance. Consider the Newport Tower in Rhode Island, a round stone structure that mainstream archaeologists date to the colonial period, but which alternative historians love to attribute to medieval visitors, possibly Vikings, possibly Templars, possibly any group that makes for a better story than colonists built a windmill. The tower has been subjected to more analysis than some crime scenes, with carbon dating, architectural comparisons, and documentary research all pointing toward a 17th century origin, but the romantic possibility that it's something older simply refuses to lie down and accept scholarly defeat, which I find oddly admirable, even as I acknowledge the academic eye-rolling it generates. You're touching those stones now, feeling their roughness beneath your palm, and you wonder whether the hands that placed them knew anything of Templar crosses and medieval secrets, or whether they were simply trying to build a functioning windmill without access to a YouTube tutorial. The air smells different here, cleaner somehow, and the sky above is that particular shade of American blue that Europeans always remarked upon in their early accounts, as if the New World had somehow gotten a better allocation of atmospheric quality. Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney in the late 14th century, features prominently in these transatlantic theories. His supposed voyage to America in 1398, accompanied by the Venetian navigators Antonio and Niccolo Zeno, has been enthusiastically promoted by authors who see in scattered evidence a coherent narrative of medieval exploration. The Zeno narrative, published in 1558, describes voyages to lands called Frisland and Estotiland, which may or may not correspond to actual places that may or may not include parts of North America, and the whole thing reads like a puzzle designed by someone who lost half the pieces and replaced them with random bits from other puzzles. Professional historians generally treat the Sinclair voyage as somewhere between intriguing but unproven, and please stop putting this in documentaries, but the idea that Templars or their successors reached American shores before Columbus remains stubbornly popular, perhaps because we love the notion that history contains secret chapters that mainstream narratives have missed. You close your eyes and listen to the wind in the unfamiliar trees, imagining what it would have meant for medieval Europeans to stand on this shore and realize that everything they thought they knew about the shape of the world was incomplete, that there was more out there than their maps suggested, that secrets could hide in blank spaces. The Templars, if they ever came here, would have found no gold-paved cities, no fountains of youth, no easy answers to the questions that had driven them across the ocean, just endless forest, indigenous peoples who had their own complex histories and no interest in European religious politics, and the kind of humbling vastness that makes even warrior monks feel small. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps disappearing into that vastness was exactly what they wanted, a final escape from a world that had turned against them, a new beginning in a land that asked no questions about papal bulls and French kings. You breathe deeply of that imaginary American air, and let the mystery remain unresolved, because some questions are better as questions, and the night is long, and we have more territory to cover before sleep claims us entirely. The mystery of the vanished Templar fleet echoes through subsequent centuries, like a melody that nobody quite remembers, but everyone feels they should, humming in the background of secret societies, treasure hunts, and the persistent human conviction that somewhere, somehow, Someone is hiding something wonderful from us. You find yourself now in the 18th century, standing in a candlelit lodge room, where men in elaborate aprons are conducting rituals that they claim descend from those ancient warrior monks, and the smell of beeswax and masculine solemnity fills the air like a particularly earnest fog. Freemasonry, that grand fraternity of peculiar handshakes and charitable works, developed an entire degree system based on Templar mythology during this period, with initiates taking on the role of knights and processing through ceremonies that would have baffled the actual medieval Templars, but which presumably meant something profound to Georgian-era gentlemen in need of a hobby. The connection between historical Templars and Freemasonry is one of those assertions that sounds compelling in documentaries, but deflates somewhat under scholarly examination, like a balloon animal that looks impressive until you realize it's mostly air. Here is the mainstream historical fact for this section. We know definitively that the Knights Templar, as an organized order, ceased to exist after the papal bull Vox in Excelso issued by Pope Clement V in 1312. Grand Master Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake in 1314, reportedly cursing both king and pope to meet him before God's judgment within the year. And somewhat eerily, both Philip IV and Clement V died within that time frame, which is either divine justice, coincidence, or excellent posthumous marketing by Templar sympathizers. The order's properties across Europe were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, another military order that had the good fortune not to owe Philip IV money and therefore escaped the accusations of heresy that proved so fatal to their Templar colleagues. The institutional Templars were gone, but the idea of the Templars, that proved far more resilient than any institution could ever be. You're handling an old book now, leather-bound and fragrant with age, one of the many volumes that have attempted to trace the Templars' secret survival through various conspiracies and brotherhoods. The pages are soft with handling, and you notice that previous readers have left marginalia, expressing either enthusiastic agreement or irritated skepticism, the eternal dialogue of believers and debunkers conducted in faded ink. The quirky historical tidbit for this section involves the actual treasure that we know the Templars possessed, which turns out to be simultaneously more mundane and more interesting than the Holy Grail. The Templar banking system had generated enormous wealth through interest on loans, fees for services, and the accumulated donations of 2 centuries of pious Christians who believed that funding the order was a solid investment in their own salvation, the medieval equivalent of buying indulgences except with better military backing. When inventories of seized Templar properties were conducted after the arrests, officials found extensive landholdings, commercial operations, ships, livestock, and substantial amounts of cash and precious metals, but nothing that suggested mystical artifacts or religious relics beyond the ordinary. No Grail, no Ark of the Covenant, no pieces of the True Cross more numerous than the forests of Europe could have supplied. Either the legendary treasure was mundane all along, or someone moved it before the inventories were taken. And the second possibility is the one that keeps treasure hunters employed and documentary filmmakers in business. You set down the book and walk through centuries as if they were rooms in a vast museum, passing displays of Templar imagery and popular culture, the video games, the novels, the films both serious and ridiculous, that have transformed medieval warrior monks into everything from holy guardians to sinister conspirators to generic bad guys for archaeologist protagonists to punch. The scholarly debate that deserves attention here concerns the actual religious beliefs and practices of the historical Templars, which remain surprisingly obscure despite the order's prominence. The confession transcripts from the trials are nearly useless as historical sources, since they were extracted under torture and followed patterns suggested by the inquisitors themselves, meaning we know more about what medieval prosecutors wanted to hear than about what Templars actually believed. Some historians argue that the charges were pure fabrication, political weapons wielded by a desperate king. Others suggest that the Templars may have developed heterodox beliefs during their long exposure to other cultures in the Middle East, syncretizing elements of Christianity with ideas encountered in Islamic, Jewish, or other traditions. The mysterious Baphomet figure that appears in the trial records has been interpreted as everything from a corruption of Muhammad to a representation of Gnostic wisdom to a simple invention by creative torturers, and the academic literature on this question alone could fill several shelves without reaching any firm conclusion. You're standing now before what might be a Templar grave marker, one of many scattered across Europe that enthusiasts have identified with varying degrees of confidence. Some are almost certainly genuine, others are wishful thinking carved in stone by much later hands, and most occupy the fuzzy middle ground where certainty goes to die peacefully. The stone is worn smooth by centuries of weather, and the touching fingers of visitors seeking connection with something ancient and mysterious. A tactile rosary of speculation. People have searched for the Templar treasure on every continent except Antarctica, and given the popularity of secret history theories, it's probably only a matter of time before someone proposes a frozen vault beneath the ice containing Templar gold guarded by penguins sworn to secrecy. Oak Island in Nova Scotia has attracted particular attention, with treasure hunters spending fortunes digging elaborate shafts in pursuit of something that may or may not exist, may or may not be connected to the Templars, and may or may not be worth the centuries of effort expended in its pursuit. The island has become a metaphor for the treasure hunt itself, the search that becomes its own purpose regardless of what waits at the bottom. You feel a certain sympathy for those searchers, those midnight researchers, and weekend archaeologists who refuse to accept that some mysteries simply remain mysteries, who believe that somewhere in the documentary record or beneath the soil lies the answer that will unlock everything. They are, in their way, the spiritual descendants of those Templars who sailed from La Rochelle into the fog, choosing uncertainty over surrender, possibility over the comfortable prison of accepted fate. The night has grown late around you now, and the candles in that imaginary lodge room have burned low, casting long shadows that flicker like memories across the walls. The Templar fleet that vanished in October 1307 remains exactly where it sailed into the realm of the unknown, where history shades into legend, and legend shades into dream, where 18 ships and their cargo of men and secrets became something larger than any physical vessels could ever contain. They became a question, an invitation, a doorway that opens onto endless corridors of possibility, and you stand before that doorway now, breathing slowly, feeling your eyelids grow heavy with the weight of 7 centuries of wondering. The fog that swallowed those ships has never quite lifted. It lingers in every library archive and every coastal ruin, in every stone that might bear a Templar cross and every theory that tries to explain where they went. Perhaps they reached Scotland and fought at Bannockburn. Perhaps they sailed to America and left traces in towers and carvings. Perhaps they simply scattered to various ports and lived out quiet lives under assumed identities, their great mystery no more than a clerical lacuna in the historical record. Or perhaps, and this is the thought that follows you toward sleep, perhaps they found something out there in the darkness, some shore or answer that we haven't discovered yet, and the mystery persists because the story isn't over, has never been over, and waits somewhere beyond the fog for someone finally to arrive and learn what the Templars carried into the night. And so we come to the end of tonight's journey, having traced the wake of ghost ships across 7 centuries of speculation, legend, and that peculiar form of historical detective work that relies as much on imagination as on evidence. The Knights Templar, those warrior monks who rose from 9 men protecting pilgrims to one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Christendom, left behind them a mystery that refuses to resolve into simple answers, and perhaps that resistance to resolution is itself the most interesting thing about them. We have walked together through the salt-sprayed quays of La Rochelle, where an entire fleet dissolved into the October darkness of 1307, leaving only questions floating on the morning tide. We have considered the political machinations of Philip IV, a king whose debts were large enough that destruction seemed more convenient than repayment, and we have acknowledged the terrible efficiency of those simultaneous arrests across France, a coordination that would impress even our modern surveillance states. The Templars who escaped, those knights and sergeants who somehow received warning, or simply were not present when the hammer fell, became seeds of legend scattered across Europe, and perhaps beyond, taking root in Scottish soil and American speculation, and the fertile imagination of every generation since. We have examined the Scotland theory, with its tantalizing hints of Templar involvement at Bannockburn, and its frustrating lack of definitive documentation, a historical argument that generates more heat than light, but which illuminates something important about our desire for secret histories and hidden connections. Rosslyn Chapel stands decorated with its mysterious carvings, whether those carvings mean anything Templar or simply reflect the peculiar aesthetic choices of 15th-century Scottish stonemasons who really liked green men and botanical motifs. We have sailed even further, across the Atlantic to shores that may or may not have welcomed medieval Europeans before Columbus claimed the honor for Spain, touching the stones of Newport and imagining Sinclair's voyage into lands that European maps left blank. The treasure theories have accompanied us throughout, that persistent belief that somewhere, somehow, the legendary Templar wealth awaits discovery, whether that wealth takes the form of gold and silver, or something stranger, relics of religious significance, or documents that might rewrite history. Freemasonry adopted the Templar legacy, real or imagined, and carries it forward into modern times, where men in elaborate regalia perform ceremonies descended, they believe, from those original warrior monks, though the historical connection remains more symbolic than genealogical. The Templars have become something larger than any historical order could ever be. They have become a symbol, a question mark carved in stone, a doorway that opens onto our deepest fascinations with the hidden, the lost, and the deliberately obscured. I want to thank you for staying with me through this long journey into mystery and mist. If you've enjoyed tonight's exploration, if these tales of vanished fleets and buried secrets have helped you relax towards sleep, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video with someone else who might appreciate a gentle historical lullaby. Your support, whether through subscribing, liking, or simply returning for another story, is what allows me to continue creating these bedtime journeys through history's most intriguing corridors. Every subscription tells me that someone out there finds value in these late-night wanderings through the past, and that knowledge means more than I can easily express. The Templars would have understood, I think, the importance of community. They built theirs across medieval Christendom, connecting brothers in a network that spanned thousands of miles, and we build ours here, in this quiet space where history becomes a path toward rest. Let your breathing slow now, matching the rhythm of waves against ancient harbor stones. The ships have sailed, the fog has settled, and somewhere in the vast darkness between waking and sleep, perhaps those missing vessels still drift, their white sails catching starlight, their holds full of secrets that have waited 7 centuries to be discovered. You don't need to solve the mystery tonight. You don't need to know where they went, or what they carried, or whether any of the theories we've explored contains a grain of truth. Some questions are better held than answered, better wondered about than resolved, and the mystery of the Templar fleet is among the finest questions history has ever posed. Let it float beside you as you drift toward dreams, a companion mystery that asks nothing of you but your gentle curiosity. The night is quiet now, the candles have burned to pools of wax, and somewhere a night bird calls across the darkness. The Templars have finished their voyage, at least for tonight, and so have you. May your dreams be filled with sails and distant shores, with mysteries that comfort rather than disturb, with the deep peace that comes from knowing that the world still holds secrets worth keeping. Sleep well, gentle listener. Sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.